the Lisbon Treaty is designed to set the direction of the European Union for many decades to come. The direction it sets is in the interests of the corporate Europe, big business dominated Europe, the armaments industry, the military establishment and the political elite. And it is absolutely inimical to the interests of ordinary working people. But I have to say, the biggest lie of all has to be on some of the yes side posters that we see on the polls. Fianna Fáil has the audacity to put up a poster saying vote yes for jobs. This is the party whose disastrous policies, catering to the greed of the speculators and the bankers, have crashed the economy and caused 1,337,000 workers to lose their jobs in the last 12 months. And they have the audacity to say something in Lisbon Treaty is going to provide jobs against the background of a generalised crisis of capitalism in the European Union as a result precisely of the type of neoliberal right-wing policies that have been pushed by the European Union. And the idea now that the Lisbon Treaty is going to somehow miraculously create a recovery or more jobs is a lie of immense proportions.
Well said,
now,
Joe.
The fear campaign, of course, is well and truly out there to prey on the insecurity and fears of working people here as a result of what has happened in regard to the crash. There will be no flight of capital, of course, as long as they continue to make profits of the extent that they have been making so far. The multinationals made €34 billion profit in 2007, 29 billion in 2006, 30 billion in 2005. Does anybody think that they're going to be at Dublin Airport with their suitcases packed to see what the result is on the 3rd of October and they'll be off with them if we vote no? Of course, it's utterly and patent nonsense. So we have to stick with the facts as far as the Lisbon Treaty is concerned. Now, in regard to workers' rights, there is absolutely nothing in the Lisbon Treaty or in the Charter that fundamentally improves the rights of workers in this country or throughout Europe. All you have to do is to look at the 130 Coca-Cola workers forced out on strike for the last 4 weeks because this, one of the most profitable companies in Europe, brought them in and said, we want your wages reduced by 50%, and if you do not accept that, you will be outsourced, and outsourced to a company which pays the minimum wage. MTL dockers, Mr. Binman workers in Tipperary faced exactly the same type of blackmail. That type of scandalous abuse of workers in the interest of profit is absolutely legal in this country now, before the Lisbon Treaty, and it will be legal after the Lisbon Treaty if it is ratified. So that puts in perspective, for a start, how transformation of the Lisbon Treaty works. It is worse than that, unfortunately, because the Lisbon Treaty categorically, in my view, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, ironically in view of its name, in fact institutionalises those judgments of the European Court of Justice where it endorsed categorically the right of contractors and subcontractors to exploit migrant workers for the sake of providing services across the borders of the European Union. Now, the 4 cases are well known: Viking, Laval, Rupert and Luxembourg. In each of them, without exception, the court came down on the side of the exploiting boss and against the interest of workers. And the reason that the Charter of Fundamental Rights will make no difference whatsoever is the small print in Article 52 says these rights are not fundamental at all, they are not absolute at all. And then they go, and anybody can read this, Article 52, paragraph 1 and paragraph 7, and then the explanation, the official explanation brought out by the European Union in 2000, which we are to take account of. That explanation told us that the Article 52 tells us how we should interpret it and interpret the limitations. It says the limitations it puts on rights are based on the case law of the European Court of Justice. And it quotes from a particular case law which said that rights can be limited in the interest of the common organisation of the market and elsewhere in the interest of the freedom of others. And both the common organisation of the market and the freedom of others has been interpreted by the European Court of Justice to mean the freedom of contractors to bring workers from low-wage economies to provide services like construction or something in higher-wage economies and to underpay them, by contrast with the going rate in those particular areas. Now, I am asking Blair Horan in particular tonight, who made a disgusting and scurrilous attack on myself, accusing me of forging and falsifying the Lisbon Treaty because of a minor textual error, which he knew very well when he was making that allegation was a lie, but he still hasn't withdrawn it. The fact is, Article 52 categorically limits the rights in the interests of the market. And they will come back and they will say the problem with Laval was because Sweden hadn't legislated for a minimum wage, or that in the Viking case also, or that Germany hadn't done something else. Even if that was the case, and it is true in Sweden they didn't have a construction registered agreement like here, even if that was the case, don't you think the European Court of Justice, if it was interested in workers' rights, would say, terrible that the Swedish government do this, they should do it, so now we will find in favour of those workers as a lesson to the Swedish government as to what it should do, instead of finding with the exploiting bosses. But what they will say is, the problem is that the Posted Workers Directive from the EU Commission wasn't transposed properly into national law. That is not true. In the Luxembourg case, it was transposed into law, but the European Court of Justice said to the Luxembourg government, you went too far when you demand that subcontractors coming from abroad should observe the same rights and conditions for migrant workers as for local workers. That's what the Luxembourg judgment found. And there is absolutely nothing that will change going forward in relation to the rights of workers, because Article 52 and the explanations and the Lisbon Treaty says we must have regard to these explanations. In other words, we must have regard to the fact that we interpret the rights of workers according to the judgments of the European Court of Justice. Nothing will change. And it beggars belief that the leadership of the trade union movement and the European trade union movement, by the way, when that judgment came out, the leader of the European Trade Union Confederation, who is now saying, I back the Lisbon Treaty, what did he say? A destructive judgment. Here is another judgment that turns the Posting Workers Directive from an instrument that was intended to protect workers, companies and labour markets against unfair competition on wages and working conditions into an aggressive market tool. And the fact that the trade union leadership, or some of them, because some unions in this country are opposing it, can endorse this type of situation beggars belief, quite frankly. And I think, therefore, that we have to be very, very categorical and honest in regard to this. And if anybody has any doubt as to what the motivation of the European Court of Justice is in these judgments, just take a quote from the Rupert judgment, which was a case in Germany where they found that it was okay to pay workers 50% of the going rate in the Lower Saxony in Germany. And the court says, requiring undertakings, that's businesses, performing public work contracts to apply the minimum wage laid down by the Buildings and Public Works Collective Agreement. That was a local agreement. They do have to obey the national minimum wage in this country and the Registered Employment Agreement. Let's be clear about that, so it's not a distraction. But this is what the court says. There was a local agreement that was applied generally in the construction industry in Lower Saxony, but that wasn't good enough for the European Court of Justice. And this is what they say. Requiring them to apply the minimum wage laid down by the Buildings and Public Works Collective Agreement may impose on service providers established in another member state where minimum rates of pay are lower an additional economic burden that may prohibit, impede or render less attractive the provision of their services in the host member state. Can it be any more clear and categorical than that? The agenda of the European Court of Justice is that on behalf of the neoliberal agenda and the big business agenda that dominates the European Union is to drive down wages and conditions. And if those judgments and that type of activity became general, then of course it would put massive, intolerable pressure on workers' wages and conditions right across the board. Dear friends, the Lisbon Treaty has nothing in it for workers. We want a different Europe. We want a Europe that is not dominated by the multinationals on the armaments merchants, but a Europe that is democratically owned, controlled and run by working people and for the big majority. It is only